Now Josh, one of the guys I shared a class with, worked at the campus TV station. And then one day, since they were short a few people, he asked if I wanted to come over and help out for an afternoon. Now, I didn't have anything better to do, and it sounded more exciting than sitting around the quad all afternoon doing nothing, and so off we went. Now, it was hard to believe that they were making actual TV shows there, but that's exactly what I watched them do, and with an impressive level of professionalism, too. The week after, I asked my buddy if he needed any extra help again, and then before long, I was running the audio board for other people's shows or editing tape on those big linear editing decks that took forever for stuff to queue up. Now it was fun as hell, and I got to meet a ton of weird, cool people, like this one guy doing a dorm room cooking show with nothing but a hot plate, or this other guy who used to rant about the Seahawks until he was red in the face and the veins were bulging in his neck. We'd record the shows, transfer them to VHS, then after sending them off to the cable channel, we'd throw little watch parties whenever they aired. Now, it was an awesome feeling seeing it go out over the airwaves, and I immediately started thinking how cool it'd be to have something I'd made broadcast as far as Tacoma. Now, I had to wait until someone quit their slot, of course, as there weren't any free ones available. But when our Seahawks guy finally ran out of trash to talk about his team, I had an opportunity to take a slot for myself. The only question was, with what? Now, I brainstormed all kinds of ideas and briefly entertained the idea of doing comedy skits. But then, I had a brainwave. Everyone has at least some local pride, right? And the one thing everyone enjoys is a damn good mystery story. So if I planned out a show that involved investigating local mysteries and led with a story that everyone would identify with, I might actually get some eyeballs on my work. And the one local legend that got not just national, but international attention was good old Bigfoot. Now, Bigfoot was actually a personal interest of mine, just not in the way you think. I was a believer once, and after moving to the Pacific Northwest, I read On the Track of the Sasquatch and The Apes Among Us by John Green, as well as The Bigfoot Casebook by Janet and Colin Board. The Apes Among Us is a particularly fascinating read, and Green is very passionate about the subject. There's just one problem. I don't believe a word of it anymore. Logically speaking, we'd have probably found Bigfoot's skeleton by now, and I'm not just talking about Peter Kane dog trainer, as while there are a plethora of other reasons why the Bigfoot myth is just that, a myth, the biggest debunker is the issue of the remains. But what I'd never personally seen is anyone putting those reasons to a true believer, one who'd actually done the research on it themselves, and if done respectfully and amicably, I figured I might have cracked the formula to some pretty great television. Now, I managed to find a guy who ran a guided Bigfoot tour that included a night of camping in areas where there had been plenty of sightings, apparently. Now, I'm guessing the camping alone gave the guests a spooky enough atmosphere when all they were really doing was hanging out and having fun together with some like-minded people. Now, I get it, man, I do. It's fun to have friends and tell spooky stories, but I wanted to know if what the guide was saying stood up to any scrutiny. And not in a mean, you're a liar, mister kind of way, more like as a way of exploring the veracity of the subject in a way that didn't sensationalize it, and asking all the questions folks at home wanted to ask on their behalf. Now, I didn't think that'd be an attractive prospect, but luckily, Brandon, the tour guide, actually agreed to it. Now, Brandon was a real character. He was warm, friendly, and immediately saw my offer as an opportunity to promote his business. He said he didn't mind if I had questions because he'd been answering them for the better part of 20 years. And as long as I didn't try making him look stupid in front of the other folks on the tour, I was welcome to ask anything I wanted. Now, my buddy Josh and I went out to meet him one weekend to shoot some opening footage that had run before that of the actual tour. Brandon looked like I imagined him. Flannel shirt, jeans, big mustache, and beer gut. Now, he was also so excited to be on a TV show, even if it was just public access, that he made for a fantastic interviewee. By the time we were done with the segment, I was actually psyched to go on the tour with him, if only for the fact it'd be fun to hang out with him overnight in the woods. And even if I didn't get to debunk the whole Bigfoot thing, and in the space of a half-hour cable access show, it'd still make for great viewing. And when the Saturday of the tour rolled around, me and Josh drove out to where Brandon was based. We borrowed a car and one of the station's crappy camcorders, and then once all of Brandon's tourists were assembled, we hit the trails, and it wasn't long before my questions began. When Brandon talked about eyewitness sightings, I brought up how unreliable they were. Then when he brought up tracks and footprints, I brought up how the famous Patterson-Gimlin tracks were eventually proven to be a hoax. I kept it friendly. There was no gotcha moments, and the other guests actually enjoyed us talking about Native American references to megafauna. And we agreed, and quite excitedly too, that modern technology brought us all closer to a definitive truth. But at least one of the other guests did not appreciate our approach. There was this older guy who looked to be in his late 40s, jean shorts, hoodie, ball cap, shades. Now, he'd been quiet for almost all of the hike, but his facial expressions and body language were getting louder and louder. Then when me and Brandon started discussing Bigfoot population numbers, he boiled over completely. Brandon made the point that animals which adapt to colder climates generally exist in low numbers, like in the case of polar bears or certain kinds of whales. It was a pretty solid retort to my point that an ape the size of Bigfoot would need a large population to avoid inbreeding. But when I circled back around to the point about calorie consumption, as Bigfoots would have to eat crazy amounts of food and would therefore leave a crazy amount of poop, I imagine, the guy with the ball cap and shades turned around and got right up in my face. The man that I'll only refer to as Angry Dave was all red and puffed up, asking what my problem was, and saying that a Bigfoot tour wasn't some place for some closed-minded college kid. I tried telling him I wasn't closed-minded, that I'd read a bunch of literature on the topic and I wanted nothing but the truth. But Dave replied that I knew nothing about the woods or real life and accused me of trying to ruin the tour for everyone else just so I could feel like a smarty party. Now I get why he was mad, and Josh had already suggested how joining an actual tour might lead to something like that. Brandon had insisted that we do just that, probably because the presence of a TV camera made him look all newsworthy or whatever. And I guess he felt his share of the blame too, because he stepped in fast to say, "It's okay, I invited the guy," offering a more private tour at Angry Dave's convenience. But Dave didn't want to hear it. He stepped closer, got louder, and even looked like he was about to swing for me at one point. Between myself, Josh, and Brandon, we managed to calm him down enough to continue the tour, with Dave doing nothing but glaring at me every time I spoke. Now, I kept the questions to an absolute minimum following the confrontation, as in addition to the nighttime stuff we were about to shoot, Josh and I had more than enough footage to put together a 30-minute segment. Now, once we had all of our tents set up, Brandon had got a little campfire going and conversations moved away from Bigfoot, and the tension started to lift. Even Angry Dave started to lighten up a little, even if he did roll his eyes or shake his head at pretty much anything me or Josh came on with. Now, after we all retired to our tents, Josh and I shot a little more footage, basically saying that we'd started shooting again if we heard any creepy noises. Now, we didn't expect to hear any. In fact, I was convinced that if we did hear any noises, it'd be Brandon out there faking them to play a friendly prank on the skeptics. But as it turned out, on that point, I was dead wrong. I was pretty tired from all the walking, and me and Josh had to get up super early that morning to check our gear. So once we shot our tent footage and lay down in our bedrolls, I don't think either of us lasted even a minute before we were dead to the world. I guess we were out around 3 hours or so, because the next thing I know, Josh is shaking me awake at like 1 a.m. while whispering, Dude, listen." We stayed quiet for a second, and then I suddenly heard this loud, sharp thwacking sound in the distance, like someone was hitting the trunk of a tree with a large branch. It might sound strange, but it was such a clearly identifiable sound, but it was also one with some very sinister connotations. Now, for those of you that don't know, Bigfoot is supposed to hit trees with sticks as a form of communication. Some say it's how Bigfoots talk to each other. And it is Bigfoots, not big feet, but others say that they're a warning to humans, and the people who've ignored these warnings have then mysteriously gone missing. Now, I didn't think it was Bigfoot at all. I thought it was Brandon. But when we got out of the tent with the camera, I saw Brandon and another tourist standing there all wide-eyed and looking spooked. I guess it was sort of a nervous reaction on my part, but I whispered a joke to Brandon about how I figured the noise would be him trying to play a prank on us. I thought he might see the funny side, but he didn't. He just shook his head like he well and truly believed it was Bigfoot out there, and then shushed us so we could keep on listening to those spaced out thwacking sounds. Now, Brandon had already explained what we were hearing during the tour, so as all the other tourists got out their tents to join us, each of them had that same look of fear and wonder on their faces. I started whispering to the camera to explain the sounds, and then out of nowhere, we all heard this blood-curdling scream from off in the distance, about the same distance the dull thwacks were coming from. Now everyone's like, "Oh my God," and even Brandon looked terrified. And I won't lie, Josh and I got pretty spooked too, and I remember thinking it was some type of prank, and then it was a damn good one. But then, one of the other tourists realized that Angry Dave's tent was empty, and I watched Brandon's head just spin around, terrified. He asked if anyone had seen or heard him, and one of the others said that they'd woken up to hear him walking off somewhere like he went to pee, but evidently he hadn't returned. Someone else then asked if Dave might have gone looking for the source of the sound, and since that scream sounded like it came from a man of Dave's age and size, Brandon went into full-on crisis mode, thinking that this guy was hurt. Now he grabbed his flashlight and then went tearing off into the woods, yelling Dave's name. The rest of us followed like we were programmed to, with the tourists close behind, and Josh and I at the rear with the camera. We ran for about a minute or two, all yelling out Dave's name, and when Brandon stopped, we stopped too. He asked us to fan out and look around, as Dave might be so hurt that he actually couldn't respond. Now, one of the other tourists then asked if he thought that Bigfoot had outright killed Dave and might have dragged him off someplace after attacking him, but Brandon said he didn't know, and it was like that answer made things worse for everyone. They wanted him to have answers, so when he didn't, it frightened everyone all the more. Now, I didn't think we were about to encounter a Bigfoot. I thought Dave had walked off and taken some tumble in the dark, or worse, maybe gotten himself attacked by an animal or something. Now, just because he hadn't been attacked by some mythical creature didn't mean that he wasn't in danger, and the same applied to us, too. Walking through those dark woods was seriously scary, and it's crazy how much fear can make you doubt yourself. And by that, I mean I was scared that I actually started wondering if I was about to be proved wrong about Bigfoot, and in spectacularly horrifying fashion. I didn't fully start to believe or anything. I just struggled to compute how nightmarishly ironic it'd be if I was torn apart by something I didn't even believe existed. Brandon had his gun with him, but no one else was armed, so I had to go walking through the dark forest with nothing but a big stick in my hand and a camera in Josh's. The whole time I'm yelling Dave's name, asking him to call out to us to let us know where he is. But I'm also spinning on the spot to face every little noise, like I was expecting Bigfoot to come rushing out of the darkness into our flashlight beams before picking us up and bashing us against the trees. I had my head on a swivel, and Josh had to do everything in his power to keep a steady shot, and he still couldn't keep his hands from shaking. But when it came too quickly for either of us to do anything about it, and I barely even saw that giant stick before it smashed into my head. I went down like a ton of bricks, while Josh was so startled by the sudden presence that he fell back on his butt and dropped the camera. But even if he hadn't, and he kept on filming as that stick smashed into my ribs, and then hips, and then legs, he wouldn't have recorded me getting attacked by a Bigfoot, because the only person attacking me was Angry Dave. Mine and Josh's yelling attracted the attention of the others, and to his absolute credit, It was Brandon who showed up seconds later with his gun drawn, telling Dave to put the stick down or he'd shoot. Now, I guess there's no love lost between me and Dave at this point, but while I appreciate that some of you might think I'm exaggerating to make him look bad, I'm definitely not. And so when I say he looks so out of his mind with rage that it appeared that he might charge at Brandon at any second, I'm not just saying that. And for a moment or two, I was legitimately scared that I was about to watch him get his head blown off. He looked at Brandon, then down at me like he wanted to just keep on hitting me. But right as he raised the stick up again, Brandon yelled out that he'd shoot if he hit me again. And that sort of brought Dave back to reality, I guess. He stepped back, dropping the stick while still red as a beet. Then I guess when he realized what he'd done and how we might have had it all on camera, we didn't, Dave turned and went running back to the camp to grab his stuff. He left just as hastily as Brandon and the other tourists yelled at him, saying the cops would be informed. I remember feeling a little smug, knowing that he'd given me all the ammo I needed to get his ass thrown in jail. But he hit me so hard that I had blood running down from my hairline, and it hurt so bad that I knew I needed to get to a hospital right away. Dave had obviously faked all the stick sounds and the scream, and according to the cops, his original intention was only to scare me. But when he saw me and Josh with our camera, especially me being lit up like a freaking Christmas tree, the red mist descended, and he attacked me with the same stick that he'd been using to hit that tree. He ended up spending about 6 months inside, which was better than nothing, I guess, whereas I got myself a nice little hairline scar as a souvenir. It sucked having to get stitches and stuff, and for a while, the doctors were worried that I'd have a pretty bad concussion. But to me, the worst thing was that Brandon revoked his permission for us to air the footage. He'd already signed a waiver, but Josh and I didn't much feel like going to war with him over it, so to speak, and he'd been so nice and welcoming it wasn't his fault that he accidentally brought along some fanatical psycho. Airing the footage would have the opposite effect on his business, so when he coupled his revocation with a polite request, I couldn't find it in myself to just ignore it. I guess that's about the end of the story, though. But don't worry, I'm not going to try and end on some poignant line about lessons learned, because I think the lessons here are obvious to all who wish to learn them. So, my mom was originally from Russia, and she lived up there during the Soviet years, but she never really talked about it while I was growing up. I learned this was because you could divide Soviet immigrants into one of two categories: those who talked about their old lives back in the USSR, and those who didn't. And those who talked tended to complain about it, saying things like, "We had equality for all, equally empty shelves and equally long lines." Or my personal favorite, "The future was bright, the present was gray, and the past was whatever the party said it was." But those who didn't talk about it, you learn not to pry. Some people escaped communism with nothing but nightmares and the clothes on their back. And thankfully, while nothing too terrible ever happened to Mom, she had a few stories of her own. Now, back when she was still a student, Mom volunteered to work at a pioneer camp for the summer, which was exactly the same as an American summer camp in almost every way. She was a guardian there, which is basically what they called their counselors, and in addition to all the games, activities, and fresh air, guardians served up generous doses of Soviet propaganda. Mom said the camps were like paradise on the surface, but in this one place, beneath the smiles and the slogans, there was a kind of tension in the air. From what she could gather, the head guardian had been selected by this one committee. Almost everything in Russia at that time was run by committee, so the decision of the guardian appointing committee had to be ratified by this other committee. Now, once their approval had been secured, the head guardian was approved. But then the head of the other committee suddenly changed his mind because his spoiled, bratty-ass son wanted to be head guardian. Now, the guy goes about trying to reverse the decision, first by bureaucracy, but when that failed, he turned to threats. No one threatened the head guardian, not directly anyway, but there was talk of having him removed, even closing the camp down completely. Mom said this went on for like 2 weeks, getting a slow drip of information, partly fact and partly rumor. And then one day, the head guardian announced the whole thing was over. A decision had come down from on high, guaranteeing his place at the camp for the next couple of years, and since the guy was a pretty beloved figure, everyone was happy about it. Every person except one. Mom said a few nights later, after all the kids had been put to bed, she was doing her rounds on the second floor of a dorm. She remembered checking in on this one group when suddenly this deep feeling of unease came over her. Russia's a place of extremes. Super cold in the winter, but then depending where you're at, it can get super hot during the summer. Now that night was no different, so the air in all the dorms was very warm. But in that one, the air felt just like a little too warm in places. And then suddenly, she started to smell the smoke. She could tell right away it wasn't just campfire smoke. A smell she was very familiar with by then because the smoke that night had an artificial, chemical sort of scent to it. Then, when she ran to the window and saw flames licking up the walls from the ground floor, she realized fire was spreading fast. So Mom hit the dorm's alarm and in doing so, unleashed total chaos. The alarm scared the kids half to death, so they were almost blind with panic as they came tearing out of their rooms. Things would have been way worse if Mom and some other guardians weren't bunked in the same building and they were able to restore a little order once they came out of their rooms. But then when a guardian discovered the stairwells were full of smoke, they realized that to escape, they had no choice but to basically throw the kids from the second floor windows, and they had to do it fast. Smoke was building up, people were coughing, and as the kids were starting to panic. Mom said that at first some of the older ones tried to help the little ones, but it wasn't long until panic took over and the guardians lost control. And then not only did she watch kids literally climbing over each other, but kids as young as 6 or 7 were pushing open the windows and then just leaping out into the dark before hitting the ground with these sickening thuds. Now, it was only the second floor, so the kids who jumped didn't get hurt too bad. But they were landing on concrete, so Mom said it was still pretty horrifying to hear their thuds as they landed awkwardly, followed by their screams of pain as they broke bones or sprained ankles. And outside on the ground, camp guardians were running around with buckets of water doing anything they could to at least slow the spread. But Mom said those buckets were all but useless against those flames. More adults poured out into the scene from the staff quarters while Mom kept on herding the kids towards the windows. One little disabled girl she was carrying went limp in her arms from the smoke, and Mom had to fight through the crowd to get her to a window. She said things were starting to look really bad, but right when the kids needed to, the bus showed up. The camp's groundskeeper, this big burly guy whose name was Grigor, ended up driving the camp's bus right up to the burning dorm, so it was running lengthways alongside it. It meant the kids had something to break their fall while jumping from the corridor windows, of which there were many. So as soon as the guardians realized what was happening, they told the kids to jump, and they came pouring out to land on top of the bus. Guardians were on the ground too, helping them down when they landed. Some of the kids hit the bus pretty hard and got hurt that way too, but even the ones who bounced or fell had something there to catch them. Mom said that Grigor's quick thinking saved dozens of lives, her own included. And then once the last few kids had jumped on top of the bus, Mom and another guardian jumped too, and just in the nick of time because Mom said that once she had her feet on solid ground, she turned to see the bus was starting to catch fire itself. By dawn, the dorm building was a soaking wet ruin. It took the fire department a while to make it out there, so by the time they arrived, the dorm was pretty much done for. Their trucks were still there by sunup, as were the medics treating injured kids, and the worst of which were laid out on blankets not far from the ruins of their dorm. Parents started showing up worried not long after because you could see the smoke for miles around. But here's where things started getting even darker, because a lot of those parents showed up to a police perimeter with cops telling them to go home and wait for news there. Mom said they wanted to control the flow of information coming in and out, so they showed up fast to stop panic from spreading. Mom helped with the cleanup and then helped set up makeshift hospital tents. But as she worked, she found herself fixated on this one little detail she'd overlooked that previous night. When she ran to the windows and saw the fire for the first time, she remembered seeing someone running for the tree line off in the distance, but then seeing the flames sent her into action, so the image of that figure running off didn't return until later. But even then, it was pretty obvious the fire was no accident. The firefighters found signs of gas or some flammable liquid, which explained the chemical smell Mom had caught early on. And then once it became clear it was arson, the police took over completely. Mom said it was obvious who did it and that the only person with any ill will against the camp was the son of that committee head, who was bitter about not getting his way. And so when the police announced that they'd found the arsonist and that it had been some hermit living a few miles away in the woods, everyone was very surprised. No one even knew that the guy had been living out there, not in all the time the camp had been running, so he'd obviously kept to himself. And then when they said they caught him with a ton of stolen gas cans, the kind used at the camp depot, things made even less sense. We hadn't noticed any fuel going missing, and why would a hermit steal gas if he didn't have anything that ran on it? But as was custom back then, when authorities spoke, people didn't talk back. The hermit was just the raggedy old loner with no one to speak up for him, and so to authorities, it was an open and shut case. They hauled him in, gave him a closed-door trial, and then announced he was going to be executed for 50 counts of attempted murder, with the aggravating factors being that his target was a dorm full of little kids. Not even a month went by. That poor hermit was executed, and then all these bigwigs went around patting themselves on the back, telling everyone the children were safe again. But Mom said that's just what they wanted them to think. The Guardian started hearing rumors about the hermit, stuff like how he was half blind, could barely walk straight most days. How does a guy like that sneak into a guarded camp, set the dorm on fire, and then run off before anyone could apprehend him? He doesn't. Because whoever really set the dorm on fire was running at full speed when my mom saw them, meaning that they were young, fit, and healthy, and not some old hermit. And the cover-up stank, and Mom said the mood got so bad that party officials came around to the camp to personally remind the Guardians that spreading false rumors meant losing their jobs or worse. Mom kept her mouth shut and her head down, but said that inside, she was boiling. After the camp closed for the season, Mom went back to her regular life, but the anger and the nightmares both stuck around. The kids mostly recovered. A few had scars from burns or falls, but all were traumatized by what they went through. Mom carried her own scars too, mental ones, in the form of the knowledge that sometimes justice gets buried under politics. Before she moved to America and once the Soviet Union started collapsing, Mom thought about digging into it more, maybe finding old records or talking to other survivors. She'd always believed it was the committee's head kid who lit the fire and that the hermit was just a convenient scapegoat. Some poor soul who made the perfect patsy, whose secret trial ensured nobody could ask any serious questions in open court. Hearing her tell it like that hit me hard. This wasn't just some story in a book that we read in history class. It was my mom's life. Something she lived through and that shaped her into the tough, no-nonsense woman she was. She always made sure that I knew the value of speaking up, even when it might seem scary, because, as she so correctly said, staying quiet lets the bad people get away with things. Many years ago, I got home from work to find my girlfriend, now wife, having dinner in front of the TV. We talked about our days as I made myself some coffee, and then suddenly, the news guy said something about a murder that had taken place close by. A local man had been found dead in his home, having been stabbed just shy of 100 times. The sheer number of wounds had us thinking, Jesus Christ, that poor man. And it was very shocking to have something like that happen in the quiet, relatively crime-free area we lived in. But then they flashed the victim's picture on screen, and as I looked at him and heard his name, I felt the color and blood drain from my face. When my girlfriend asked if I knew the guy, I nodded. I said his name was Ryan. Now, it's not his real name, and he was a counselor at a summer camp that I went to as a child. Now, she knew that I'd been to a camp as a kid, but I'd never told her the story of Ryan and how much he'd affected my life one summer back when I was a child. And then over the next hour or so, I laid it all out for her. And this, in so many words, is what I said. When I was 11 years old, Mom and Dad decided that I was going to summer camp again that year. We moved across the country not long before, so while I wasn't psyched about going to a new place, I was way past the tantrums and I don't want to go phase of my life. And they showed me some pamphlets for this place called Camp Choctaw. Now, it's not its real name, but I thought it sounded cool. And the kids looked like they were having some huge amounts of fun, and the theme was all things Native American, with plenty of archery, making teepees, and weaving dream catchers. During the final week, the camp held a big powwow where all the kids got to make their own headdresses, and the counselors cooked on a barbecue instead of in the cafeteria. I thought it looked awesome, and while making new friends was always nerve-wracking, I was stoked to be heading to Camp Choctaw for a month come summertime. The camp was in a giant clearing out in the middle of the woods with these cool log-style cabins with big porches scattered around. A big open pavilion thing sat in the middle with picnic tables, and further back I could see the cafeteria and what looked like some sort of activities lodge. Now, there were also a couple of brightly colored teepees set up near the pavilion, but we were told that they were just a display piece and that no one got to sleep in them. Now, that didn't matter to me, though. But even without getting to sleep in an actual teepee like a Native American, the place looked awesome. There were already tons of kids running around by the time me and my dad showed up. I could see the counselors too, mostly college-aged guys, but a couple of older men also. And apart from the cook, who seemed kind of grouchy, they all seemed like really fun dudes. All the younger guys were wearing bandanas or beads and stuff like that, and I remember this blonde dude came over to my dad's car with this big smile like, "Hey buddy, you ready for the best week ever?" Then as we're getting out of the car, he asked, "What's your name?" "My name's Ryan." That was my first meeting with him, and never in a million years did I imagine things would end the way they did. But life is strange sometimes like that, I guess. Now, after I said goodbye to my dad, I joined the other kids, and then eventually I heard my name being called by one of the counselors. I joined a big group of boys and being herded over towards the main lodge where the head counselor, a taller, older man, told us that we were all in cabin 4 and that our group name was the Wolves. Now, we followed him down this little path through the trees where we were met by an awesome log cabin with a big wooden wolf carved over the door. Now, it smelled like bug spray and cleaning fluid. And then as we all piled in and started picking bunks, I remember this skinny kid with messy brown hair and a dinosaur shirt coming up to me and asking if he can take the one above mine. Now, I told him, "Sure, dude," trying to sound nonchalant even though I was pretty nervous. And then over the next half hour or so, we got to know each other a little. Now, by the time the counselor came in to give us a little orientation speech, Tommy and I were already sitting on the floor together, sharing snacks while laughing about how this one kid looked like a burrito when all zipped up in his sleeping bag. Now, that first night, we all stayed up way too late, planning out all the cool stuff we were going to do in these whispers. And then for the next 3 weeks or so, Tommy and I became best friends. Now, whether it was making clay pots, being partners in 3-legged races, or finding sneaky ways to help ourselves to some extra s'mores, Tommy and I did it together. It felt like it was going to be the best summer of my whole life, and that me and Tommy were going to be best buddies till the day we died. And then one day, about midway through the second week, I woke up in the middle of the night to find Tommy gone from his bunk. I needed to use the bathroom, really bad too, so my first thought after my eyes opened was bathroom. But as I got up, that's when I noticed Tommy's bunk was empty. I figured he'd also gone to take a leak, so I walked out of the cabin thinking that I'd bump into him or see him on the way or whatever. But on the walk to the bathroom, I didn't see Tommy, and neither was he in the bathroom when I walked inside there. Now I'm thinking, that's weird. And then after taking a whiz and washing up, I walked out into the night again to sort of yell whisper Tommy's name, like, "Tommy! Tommy!" At first, there was nothing but silence, and so I kept going towards the pavilion near where the teepees were and kept on calling out for Tommy. Now, it felt creepy as hell being out there all alone after dark, then as I'm thinking I should maybe just go back to my dorm, I hear this low, eerie whine, almost like an animal, but different. It sent literal chills through me, and while I somehow managed to keep quiet, I sprinted back to my cabin and jumped in my bunk, waking everyone up in my cabin in the process and severely pissing them off. They asked me what was wrong, but when I said, "There's something out there," they listened for just a second before being like, "No, there isn't, dumbass. Go back to sleep." Now, it might sound weird, but being shamed like that actually did calm me down. If my cabin mates weren't freaked out, then it was most likely just my imagination getting the better of me. I also realized I was scared Tommy was headed home early for some reason, like he'd gone off to the nurse with some illness in the middle of the night and was on his way to the hospital or something with me none the wiser. But then in the morning, and much to my relief, there was Tommy, lying in his bunk like the previous night's strangeness was nothing but a weird dream. I was majorly relieved to see him, but since the other kids had also noticed he was missing, it wasn't just me who wanted to know where he'd gone. But when asked, Tommy told us that he'd gone over to the counselor's bathroom for a dump, instead of using the gross one that we all shared. I didn't just buy it. It was like, that boy's a genius, because that shared outhouse thing was nasty as hell. But after we were all done being like, "The hell didn't we think of that?" I told Tommy about the weird noise that I heard outside. I said it sounded like an animal, but that it also had this kind of creepy familiarity to it. And Tommy just looked at me blankly for a second and then said that he hadn't heard anything during the walk to the counselor's place, or on the way back again. But then, and I know this might sound weird, I couldn't tell if he was serious or not. Tommy had pulled a few pranks on me over the previous few weeks, enough that I got an idea when he was lying or not, and when he told me that he didn't hear anything, he couldn't hold eye contact. And I asked him once if he was sure, and then when he insisted, I changed the subject and jokingly suggested that there was a vampire or werewolf running around camp after dark. Tommy played along and laughed, but something just felt off. I figured maybe he was tired and hoped that he wasn't coming down with something that would result in him going home early. We kind of dawdled behind as we're talking, with all the other kids filing past us on their way to breakfast. And then just after I cracked the joke about the vampires or werewolves, a counselor I called Todd came over to usher us along. Now, Todd was friendly enough, but you know when you just sort of get a bad feeling about someone when you're a kid? Yeah, that. He just seemed kind of fake, like he was always right on the cusp of his patience wearing thin, at which point he'd drop the cool counselor act and revert to his natural douchebag-like state. Now, he came over saying, "Hey guys, everything all right?" But before I could even answer, Tommy was making a beeline for the cafeteria. Now, I remember thinking, "Dude, wait up," in my head, but while I didn't strictly like Counselor Todd, I couldn't exactly just go walking off without answering him. So I was kind of glued to the spot thinking, damn it, now I gotta talk to him. I basically lied and told him everything was fine, and then he told me to catch up with the others. But then as I'm walking off, Todd asked if I needed someone to take me to the bathroom. I was 11, dude, not like 4. No one had asked me if I wanted them to take me to the bathroom since I was back in diapers. But again, this dude's an authority figure, so I'm not rude to him. I'm just thinking, no thanks, Todd, I'm good. I was actually kind of mad when I caught up with Tommy. I mean, not like mad, but I was still saying, dude, why the hell did you just leave me with that weirdo? He told me he was hungry and just wanted to get to the cafeteria, but I could tell that wasn't it. I got so frustrated that I asked him pretty loudly what the hell had gotten into him. only to be immediately warned by one of the counselors to keep my cool. I ended up apologizing to Tommy after breakfast, saying I didn't mean to yell at him, but that's when he offered his own apology and told me how I was kinda right. Something was bothering him, so much it was making him feel sick, so sick that he didn't want to eat. And it was true, all he'd done was push his food around on his plate, and this was after telling me he was so hungry he abandoned me to Todd. But when it came to telling me exactly what was bothering him, Tommy wouldn't say. I had to assume it was some kind of medical thing, because why the hell else would he just be going to call his mom and dad and ask if they'd come get him the next morning? I practically begged him not to go, and to wait and see how he felt later that day. But Tommy was adamant. He felt awful and he needed to go home. Now, I was devastated, but after going through the stages of grief over the course of about an hour, I just landed on acceptance. I put on a happy face and then tried to make sure Tommy's final day at camp was a good one. And while I was kind of successful in that front, the rest of that day was still kind of awkward. Tommy never did get his spark back. He was just too preoccupied with something, and I figured it was my job to just be a good friend and distract from it as best I could. But since Tommy was down, I was down too, so it wasn't long before Counselor Ryan, the guy who first greeted me when I arrived at the camp, came over to see what was up. Ryan was pretty much everyone's favorite counselor and had this total big brother vibe about him. He was good at sports, definitely had that jock feel about him, but at the same time he was warm, approachable, and made sure no one felt left out or ignored. I really looked up to the guy, so when he came around and asked if everything with me and Tommy was okay, he'd also seen me yelling at Tommy, I basically poured my heart out. I said he was acting weird, that he wanted to go home and that something was bothering him, but he wouldn't tell me what. Ryan then gave me what could have been a movie monologue saying I was a good friend, Tommy was lucky to have me, and that everything would turn out just fine if I acted with integrity and always told the truth. Now, 11-year-old me ate that up, especially coming from Ryan, and then the rest of the days seemed that little bit brighter. And like I said, Tommy was much quieter than usual, so after dinner there was no staying up late and whispering between bunks. But then for a second night in a row, when I woke up in the middle of the night to go take a pee, Tommy was not in his bunk. Now that time I knew that I wouldn't see him on the way to the bathroom. That's not where he was going, but as I was creeping through the darkness outside, calling out Tommy's name somewhere between a yell and a whisper, I heard that skin-crawling, high-pitched whine again. It scared the hell out of me, but I didn't run that time. I stayed silent and still, waited to hear it again, and then realized it was coming from the teepees near the pavilion. I crept towards them, then heard the whining sound a third time, only on that occasion I heard a grown man say something like, "Shush." It was definitely coming from inside one of the teepees, and although I was scared out of my mind, my desire to help Tommy spurred me forward. I almost wasn't surprised to see him when I opened up that teepee, but I was surprised to see Counselor Todd in there with him, and I was especially surprised to see Todd standing there, wearing nothing but socks. I was so shocked I dropped the tent flap, and then went running off towards the counselor's cabins, only to find that none other than Counselor Ryan was headed towards me. You can imagine how relieved I was to see him, right? How he might as well have been Superman walking over to save the day. Well, imagine that feeling and double it. When he asked me what was wrong, I told him Tommy and Counselor Todd were in the teepee together, and at first Ryan was just like, "Okay, and?" But then I was obviously like, Todd is naked in there." But instead of being horrified or even asking me to clarify what I'd said because he couldn't believe his ears, Ryan just said, "That's cool, buddy. Me and you can go have some grown-up fun too if you want." I'd never smelled alcohol in anyone's breath before. Not like I did then, anyway. My dad only ever drank beer, and only after me and my sister had gone to bed. But even today, that smell brings me back to that dark night at Camp Choctaw, and the horror I felt after Counselor Ryan asked me to join him. It was me who couldn't believe what I just heard, not just because of what it entailed, but because I'd never had anyone talk to me like that before. All I could do was stand there, dumbstruck with horror, until Ryan reached out and tried to take me by the arm. And that's when my soul returned to my body, I guess, and his touch had me recoiling like his fingers were made of hot coals. I couldn't bring myself to scream. I don't know why, but I just couldn't. I felt like I was in a dream. I didn't want people to know what had happened, and not at first anyway. So I just ran back to my bunk, curled up against my sleeping bag, and just laid there for hours. Trapped in this waking nightmare of reliving what happened over and over in my head. And by the time morning rolled around and the head counselor came over to speak with me about that previous night, I couldn't bring myself to talk about it. I couldn't even look at Tommy, who by then had walked past me with his bag towards the counselor's building, where he was due to be picked up by his parents. And I couldn't bring myself to look at Counselor Ryan either, not as the head said he heard that I had a bad dream. I just nodded along. Yeah, sorry for scaring everybody. And it was twice as horrific because I suddenly found myself where Tommy was, or still was, trapped in this cage of not being able to talk about it for what were a bunch of different reasons. Fear, shame, disgust, you name it. I then did the same thing as Tommy and lied that I was feeling so sick that I needed my parents. And I had to wait until the afternoon for Dad to get there, but he didn't need much convincing when I talked to him over the phone. I guess he could hear it in my voice. That fear and shame and disgust that I mentioned. Fathers know their sons like that, then almost as soon as we're on the highway and Camp Choctaw was in the rear window, I broke down crying. Telling my mom and dad about what happened was easier than I thought it would be, I guess because of that safety I felt. But the thing that had me bursting into tears over and over was the thought of Tommy having to tell his parents what happened, because he was obviously in a way worse situation. Now, we had swapped phone numbers long before we both left camp, so I was able to give Tommy's number to my father, and he contacted Tommy's parents immediately, and I remember feeling as if everything was going to be fine. Dad was going to fix everything, and in that omnipotent parental way that seems like magic to kids who don't know how the world works yet. I remember Mom hugging me, and the mute sound of Dad's voice while he talked on the phone in his office. He was in there for a while, but when he came out, I figured everything had been fixed. But I was wrong. Dad came back into my bedroom and in so many words asked me, tactfully, if I made the whole thing up. He didn't outright accuse me of lying because I think he knew that I believed something had happened to Tommy, but when he put the same thing to Tommy's parents and they asked their son, he denied everything. I couldn't believe it at the time. And now it makes all the sense in the world to me, but in the moment, I couldn't understand why Tommy would be cool with the counselors not being punished for what they did to him. I tried telling my dad that it was Tommy who was lying, which made everything all the worse because it was like me versus him by that point. I knew he'd hate me for trying to tell the truth when all he wanted to do was move on and pretend it never happened, but I couldn't just stay quiet. Sometimes I wonder if I should have just moved on and forgotten about it instead of turning a whole year of my life into this slow nightmare with no end in sight. But as they used to say to knights back in the day, always tell the truth, even if it leads to your death. At least that's what I tell myself to keep the doubt and regret at bay. Dad didn't give up. He and Mom believed me, and they even said years later that what Tommy and his parents said didn't wash. They said it was that classic sort of victim in denial thing, whereas I was able to talk about it because I hadn't actually been violated. Dad was the one who adopted the whole thing as like his own personal cause, one he'd fight to the bitter end. And while that might sound like a nice thing to say, the reality of that bitter end left an even more bitter taste. Regardless of whether Tommy was going to tell the truth or not, Dad got in touch with the cops and relayed everything I'd said to them. That kicked off this whole investigation side of things, and I had to go talk to some police lady for hours in some cozy, colorful family room, which was supposed to make me feel safe and comfortable. Well, it didn't work, and I had a major panic attack when I got to the part where Ryan made a move on me. I only cried when I described seeing Tommy in the teepee with Todd. It made me feel sick to my stomach, but I was able to talk about it with her. But then once I got to the Ryan part, it was like I was right there again, standing in the dark and smelling the booze on his breath, and all I wanted to do was run. When it was all over, I'd given my statement in full. Everyone kept telling me how brave I'd been and how everything was going to be just fine. But, and just like with Ryan's little movie monologue speech, that was a lie too. I didn't know what was coming, and no one took the time to warn me either. I guess because how the hell do you even explain a thing like that to an 11-year-old? Sit them down and say, oh, by the way, no one's going to believe you, and there's going to be a huge campaign to make us out to be crazy liars to try and scam a summer camp out of their hard-earned cash. Nah, they wouldn't understand, and so no one tried. The first I heard of any pushback, Dad was screaming at Mom in the kitchen one day when I got home from a friend's. Their mom gave me a ride, and when I walked inside, I thought Dad was mad at Mom for some reason, but he wasn't. He was mad at something he read in the paper. According to some reporter, Camp Choctaw had conducted a full and thorough investigation of their counselor's conduct, and had concluded that no wrongdoing whatsoever had taken place. They welcomed any kind of police investigation and claimed they'd fully cooperate, but when push came to shove, there just wasn't enough evidence or testimony without Tommy. And the more my dad pushed them to change their mind, the harder they pushed back. Then in the end, the cops said if he didn't leave them alone, he'd be charged with harassment. We had to basically hold out hope that Tommy was going to change his mind, tell the truth, and allow us to bring both a lawsuit against Camp Choctaw and charges against its counselors. But while we're waiting, the wave of negative stories hit. Someone wrote into one of the papers claiming to be a relative of an accused counselor and basically saying we were liars trying to extort Camp Choctaw. The story even made it on the air when some talk show host ran a phone-in about it. Some people fought in our corner, saying the police ought to do more to encourage victims to come forward, but others said all kinds of crazy stuff about us, like how my dad had only taken a dislike to Camp Choctaw because it revered native culture and taught respect for those that came before. I cannot overemphasize what complete nonsense that was, and I also can't overemphasize how furious it made my dad. But not just furious either. He got legitimately depressed over it. He drank more, he took time off of work because of the stress, and it was a terrible time for everyone involved, but I guess none more so than Tommy. He ended up moving out of state with his family. We got no warning. Me and him never spoke again after we climbed into our bunks on that last night of camp. And we heard it through the newspaper when someone wrote about how the silent witness, as they called him, had moved on for good. My family ended up moving too, mostly because Dad had his reputation absolutely shredded in the media, with a pretty prominent columnist calling him a racist who'd ruin his own son's life in the hopes of lining his pockets. He's had a personal prejudice against reporters ever since, at least certain kinds, and to be honest, I can't blame him either. If the media had taken our side, things might have ended up way different. I think that's what would have pushed Tommy to make the right decision and made sure the people that hurt him got what's coming to them. But whatever chance he had of changing his mind will have been snuffed out the first time he heard about the counter-accusations, saying how we were being coached by our parents so they could pocket some cash. Now, the whole thing probably marks the sorest and lowest point of my entire life, and although me and Tommy might not be able to get justice anymore, it doesn't mean no one can. I guess the whole point of telling this story all these years later is to tell people how, if stuff like this happens, you need to talk about it. Even if you get called a liar and people say the worst stuff imaginable about you, you can't give up. Not just because you owe it to yourself, but because you owe it to the other victims too. The ones who weren't able to get justice for themselves and punishment for their abusers.